and welcome. Tonight I would like to answer a question that I got from one of my viewers under my latest video. The question reads: I'd love to know more about your own personal definitions / understanding of traditional and folk witchcraft, how they relate to one another for you, and some of the ways this interplay informs your personal practice. So I think this is a great question, and it comes from a place of curiosity, but also this premise, I guess, that everybody perceives those traditions or practices differently. And while that is true, of course, and I will get to that in a moment, explaining how I perceive those things and how they manifest in my own practice, I'm one of those people who think that we have official definitions for a reason, and I don't like to reinvent the wheel in that regard. I believe that if we had personal definitions for everything that exists, then having definitions would be useless, because the point of definitions is for people to be able to understand what we are talking about to each other. If we want to find a common understanding of what we are talking about, we need to first agree on the definition of what we are talking about. In this regard, this would be traditional witchcraft and folk magic, those two kinds of practices. While everybody's practice has its own unique flavor, and that can't be escaped, that's just the reality of the craft. If you practice, you know this. Even if you practice within a specific tradition, even an initiatory tradition, your unique craft, your personal craft is still going to differ, because you are your own individual entity that perceives the world through a different set of senses than all the others around you. And that's enough to make your craft unique. That said, though, as I said, I'm a fan of establishing a definition of what we are talking about first. So, to draw upon definitions of traditional witchcraft, I am usually looking at definitions that are established by historians, for example, or practitioners who would be considered authorities in the field, broadly speaking. So, traditional witchcraft could be perceived as first a tradition of witchcraft that's separate from all the Wiccan traditions, because that's how the definition traditional witchcraft first came to be in the first place. It became a thing because practitioners of witchcraft wanted to differentiate their craft or their traditions from all the branches of Wicca specifically. So traditional witchcraft is definitely non-Wiccan. That we know for sure. Another thing that's often mentioned when it comes to traditional witchcraft is that it's either pre-modern in its structure and or drawing from historical forms of witchcraft and folk magic. So that means drawing from historical sources for information about your craft. This often in practice means drawing from sources such as the classical grimoires or the witch trials, or sources that describe how witches practiced their craft in the early modern era or early modern times and prior to that time period. Another and last component that often shows up in definitions of traditional witchcraft specifically is that it's rooted in European folklore. And here, of course, we could be arguing whether it should be only European folklore or all kinds of folklore broadly, globally. I will not argue this today. I don't have an opinion one way or another because I focus on my own craft, and I don't think I'm in any way an authority that should dictate how people perceive their craft and how they choose to label it. So I am a practitioner of traditional witchcraft because my craft fits all of the criteria that I just mentioned to you. So it's non-Wiccan, drawing from historical forms of witchcraft and folk magic, and is rooted in my case, European folklore. So that's why I am considering myself a practitioner of traditional witchcraft. While we are at this topic, I guess, it could be helpful because I feel like traditional witchcraft as a field of magic or witchcraft can be confusing, especially to people who are kind of new to this whole thing. If you don't study the history of the occult and the history of witchcraft, it can be kind of confusing to know what's what and why some practices are considered to be ceremonial magic, while others are witchcraft, while others don't fit any of those and are considered just occult practices, etc. So I will try to give some examples of streams of traditional witchcraft. I saw this classification previously somewhere on the internet, I can't remember now. But this is something that you will arrive at yourself if you read and study enough of the history of witchcraft, I guess. The streams of traditional witchcraft that we know of or that are broadly recognized today would be firstly culture-based traditional witchcraft, and that means, specific cultures such as the Slavic culture, the Scottish culture, Italian culture, and so on. So in this regard, my witchcraft is specifically rooted in the Slavic culture. As I mentioned in my previous video, this is where I was born, this is where my ancestors come from, this is where I still live, and where I grew up. So this is just the culture I've been always immersed with and in, and that's why I don't see any other cultural options for myself. And when you practice land-based forms of witchcraft, the cultural aspect of it often comes in handy. It's not really necessary, it's not something that you can't do without, honestly. But it's very handy when you're working with local land spirits, etc., when you want to dig into the lore to, for example, read all the legends about the spirits that reside in your region to perhaps be better equipped to work with those spirits, to recognize them, to cultivate their history, and to just show respect for who they are by knowing who they've been recognized to be throughout the centuries in your region. Anyway, so the first stream is culture-based traditional witchcraft. Then we move on to grimoire-based traditional forms of witchcraft. So those would be sourced in classical grimoires. So, all those that come from early modern times or previously to that. So those would be books like the 6th and 7th books of Moses, the Clavicule of Solomon, the Petit Albert, the Book of Saint Cyprian, Dragon Rouge, the Book of Honorius, the Black Pullet, the Grimorium Verum, and so on. There's plenty, really. So if you practice grimoire-based forms of traditional witchcraft, that means that you employ those traditional techniques and methods that are described in those grimoires. While we are at the topic of grimoires, I think it's important to mention that there is a huge difference between practicing an actual grimoire-based practice versus being inspired by grimoires. Many people who claim to be practicing grimoire-based practices of witchcraft actually practice just the inspired ways, right? Because a lot of the practices described in those grimoires are very hard to replicate these days, unless you don't shy away from practices that are highly illegal and really unnecessary in today's day and age. But of course, that's not the case with all of the grimoires. A lot of them have a lot of content that's very important to study and experiment with for every serious practitioner of traditional witchcraft, because they influenced all the other forms of witchcraft so much. And you won't know that, you won't know where a lot of traditional practices come from if you don't study the grimoires, because you won't realize, you won't have the comparison, right? So whether or not you are a fan of this genre of witchcraft, I think it's very important to study the grimoires and kind of learn for yourself and decide for yourself. Basically, come up with an opinion based on information that you glean from those sources and not secondhand somewhere else. Other than the culture-based and grimoire-based, we also have those that some would argue shouldn't really count, but still, this is something that seems to be very popular these days, especially among the kind of newer witches, which could be, I guess, described as practice-based types of witchcraft. And here you could give examples like hedge witchery specifically, or the poison path. Some people count things as green witchery or kitchen witchery. I'm not personally sure if these can be counted as individual paths enough to be considered, you know, paths of their own, if that makes sense. I think those are just aspects of everyday life that every witch, whether they want to or not, encounters and therefore has to address in their craft as well. So, you know, it's kind of like saying, I specifically enjoy breathing. No, like all of us do that, right? So, but I don't want to argue on that. Everybody can make up their own mind. Then another stream, I guess, of traditional witchcraft would be hereditary witchcraft. So that's the kind of traditions that are based in family practices and are passed down from the older generations to the younger. And that's how it's passed within the family, right? Even though that's a very rare kind of witchcraft, it does exist. I do know of some examples of practitioners who actually have that kind of background, so not much really can be said about it other than that, because those practices, because they are, you know, closed within a family, you don't really have a way of learning what they are. And then lastly, I guess, we have some more modern or less universally experienced streams of traditional witchcraft that have become almost those formative paths for the term traditional witchcraft to even come to exist in the first place. So that's the initiatory traditions of Cochrane craft. So that's the one that was established by Robert Cochrane. Then we have the Sabbatic craft, which was established by Chambly and his whole cultus sabbati thing. Then we have the fairy tradition, which is based in the USA actually, and was established by Victor and Cora Anderson. And lastly, I'm mentioning this because I know sooner or later this will be included among those, which is the Cornish traditional witchcraft, and the head of that would be probably Gemma Gary. Oh, and one last, the Luciferian tradition, which is based in the kind of mythopoetic approach to the mythos of the morning star of Venus. That one is very syncretic, very complex, but also something that some of those traditional initiatory groups kind of lean towards as well, namely the Sabbatic craft, for example. That's, I guess, more or less the full scope of what traditional witchcraft can be. Those of you who are practitioners of traditional witchcraft, you're already more than aware of those possible streams to choose from. I'm mostly mentioning this just so that we have a really clear understanding of what we are talking about when we are talking about traditional witchcraft. So now I feel like I equipped myself and all of the viewers with enough background and information when it comes to the definition of traditional witchcraft that I can finally speak about how I perceive traditional witchcraft, what it means to me and what it looks like in my practice. So my traditional witchcraft is mostly culture-based. That's why it's so deeply linked with folk magic and the folk magic of my people, of the Slavic people, that I don't really think that those two can be fully separated. I think, to me, in my practice, what it looks like is that they are kind of one and the same to some degree. Of course, when it comes to the sources that I draw from, as I mentioned in the previous video, I draw a lot of inspiration from the witch trials, specifically from Poland, which is where I live. There's countless sources that describe those accounts of witches, what they shared when they have been tortured during the trials, as well as other accounts, studies of historians and folklorists and ethnographers and so on into those practices. Those are, to me, especially important sources because they draw all those accounts and all this information that we have together, and that allows me and any reader basically to find so many commonalities between those accounts, and not only within, you know, the accounts of witches from Poland, but also when you compare it to the witch trial records from other countries in Europe, it turns out that it's very cohesive, that a lot of those practices are described in a very similar, if not identical way, which I know that traditions such as the one from Cornwall, from Gemageri, is very much based on that, because I can see so many similarities, and that instinctively tells me that if so many traditions in Europe build their specific flavor of traditional witchcraft based on those accounts, then perhaps my instinct to do that is also correct. So of course this is something that some people would consider controversial, considering that many of those accounts come from people who have been tortured and therefore perhaps forced to say certain things in the way that they said them. But I think what needs to be kind of separated from this whole context of the tortures and the death and all of that hostility and all of that bullshit that took place during the witch trials, what those accounts really show us is not necessarily practices of individual witches, because we don't know if the people who were giving these confessions were actually witches or not. But what they give us is actually a very cohesive kind of picture of what witchcraft was perceived to be within the society of that time, so the early modern period and before that period, right? If it's so cohesive, that means that this is the perception of the whole culture of what witchcraft is. And because it's so cohesive, that gives us enough of a foundation to build our own craft off of. And when you compare that, those witch trial confessions and accounts, to recorded practices of folk magic, in my case from Poland, I can also see so many fucking similarities that, to me, when I compare the two and then I combine them together, what I arrive at is a really cohesive system of witchcraft that's ready to be practiced. And of course, this contains all the traditional elements that you will see within most traditional witchcraft streams that I mentioned to you previously. So you will definitely have things like sabbats at the top of mountains for certain periods around the wheel of the year. You will have spirit flight to the sabbat under the mountain or on meadows or in different places like cemeteries or burial mounds, etc. You will have practices like hedge witchery, hedgecraft, so going into trance to contact the dead or talk to spirits of animals, plants, and land spirits, local spirits. You will also have a lot of accounts and practices describing forming relationships with local spirits, especially local devils or local daimons or familiars, as well as other spirits. And many of the names of those spirits are also very, cohesive and pop up kind of regularly in different places around the region. What else? Also just, the practices of curses. That's very, very, very prominent both in the witch trial confessions and in descriptions, documented descriptions of folk magic practices. This would be especially malicious practices related to basically fucking up your neighbor in various ways, often having to do with kind of living the farmer life, which was the reality of most people back in the day, as well as manipulating people to fall in love with somebody, making people fall sick, making people die, making their animals go sick or die, sending various spirits towards people to harm them, destroying people's fields, making their cows' milk go bad, and so on. Those are practices that if you practice traditional witchcraft, culture-based traditional witchcraft anywhere across Europe, you will find those exact same elements to it, because they seem to be Europe-wide. Of course, I'm not saying here that what I'm describing to you is in any way a revelation. This is, I guess, a common ground for all types of traditional witchcraft that you will encounter that is culture-based and based in folk magic. Yeah, those are just some examples. And of course, my way of practicing does not include all of the elements that I mentioned to you. There are elements that I include in my practice, such as, the hedge witchery. So basically a lot of spirit flight, trance work, working with local spirits, working with familiar spirits, some plant work, maybe aspects of what people consider the poison path, and working with the devil. Yeah, that's most of the aspects of my traditional witchcraft / folk magic. Now, of course, what needs to be mentioned, and I haven't really elaborated on this yet, is the folk magic aspect of my practice, and just the folk magic practices in general. Because people who don't practice folk magic often assume that it's some kind of old school, archaic way of practicing that strays away from anything that's modern in any way. I'm here to debunk that in case that's the belief you hold. Folk magic has always been the kind of magic that's practiced by the people, and by saying that I mean common folk, the grey mass that we all are, aside from the few chosen one. I perceive myself as part of the grey mass. I think I'm just a regular human like everybody else. I don't see myself as special in any way, and therefore I see folk magic as a means of survival that's available to all of us who don't have the means from being privileged, basically. So because folk magic has always been the kind of practice that's rooted in what's available at the limited means that you have, that means that folk magic is also the kind of magic that's most open to evolution based on just the conditions of living that surround you. That means that folk magic will never be the kind of practice that's stuck in the past. Actually, the opposite. I feel like when it comes to folk magic, and when I see other practitioners and what they do, they will utilize everything and anything that's around them. And that means that, what we have today in 2022 is the tools that we use, right? You're not going to exclude things unless they are harmful to your practice because they are harmful to the spirits or will fuck up your results, but that's another topic entirely. Practicing folk magic in 2022 means that you are not stuck in the past. You actually can utilize realistically what's around you. And that means both being in touch with the land around you as well as the means and resources that you have available. So that, when combined with traditional witchcraft, actually I feel like traditional witchcraft in comparison is the one stuck in the past. But I personally love that. That's my way of honoring my ancestors as well. I really enjoy being minimalistic in my craft, just trying to utilize and go off of what the land gives me alone. I just see the beauty in seeing the work of my own hands, practicing the kind of craft that uses minimal, if any, tools at all, and the most of the magic that happens, it happens thanks to great sacrifice and great openness to the land around you. And that means working with fear a lot. That means going to the dark, abandoned places at night. That means being open to transgressing your limitations. And by that, I don't mean physical limitations. I mean the limitations of the mind. So the things that are considered scary, that are considered taboo, that are considered not normal by today's societal standards. That's beyond that threshold. That's where the craft lies. To me, that's what makes it traditional witchcraft, really. I don't know if that answers your question in any way. I could just go on and keep talking about this for hours. I could also throw a whole bunch of books at you, books that would show the exact sources that I draw from, but the truth of it is that 99% of the sources that I use are in my native language, so they would be mostly useless for you. And if you speak Polish and if you're interested in any of it, just hit me up and I can send you a list of books that I think are worthwhile if you want to practice Polish folk magic and the kind of traditional witchcraft that's rooted in our culture. Anyway, what do you think about it? What does traditional witchcraft mean to you? How do you practice it? Which one of those streams of witchcraft would you classify yourself as fitting the most? I don't know. I'm curious, so let me know. See you soon, perhaps.